أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله نور السماوات والأرض Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am particularly grateful for you all being here, despite the fact that we're all very sleepy, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate coming after Shaikh, because in some sense, he's filled you up, and now it's time to do something a little different. I've put this Quranic verse on the PowerPoint, and we'll revert to it, but I want you to just hold it for a minute or two. We will show them our signs in the horizon and in themselves, until it is clear to them that it is the truth. And the theme of this conference is the Quran as universal mercy. And in this time, like every other time, we are in dire need of mercy. The Quran, as we are told, is constituted by verses. The Arabic word for verses is the ayat. And the word ayat can also be translated as signs. So the Quran in its very structure can be said to be constituted by a set of signs that need to be deciphered and engaged with. And I think Dr. Hamilton this morning blessed us all with the most exquisite presentation of 16-year-olds engaging with these signs. And let's stay with the word ayat just for a little bit. Signs. What are signs? Indicators, pointers, things that ought to facilitate our movement. If we are indeed to engage in any meaningful way, it demands our responsiveness. Signs are unstable and unfixed, since they are open to a variety of possible understandings. The Quran tells us there are those amongst us who have better understandings, and others who wrangle fruitlessly over its meanings. Signs push us to move, to journey, to expand our beings by engaging this set of signs. Ayat provide us with a sense of orientation, propelling us to move and to be responsive. And this notion of responsive movement suggests that our engagement with the Quran is to be constantly dynamic. So we have this notion of the Quran as a set of ayat, of signs, and I think Shaykh Kabir also spoke very beautifully to how Rumi engaged with that set of signs in the most sublime way. But this set of signs, the Quran, reveals to its believers yet another set of signs. And it tells us that there are other signs, and those signs are on the horizons and within ourselves. So human beings who accept the divine nature of the Quran as a set of ayat are told by the Quran that in the pursuit of the truth, or reality, al-haq, we in fact don't simply have a text, but the text is part of this very intimate threefold relationship of the Quran with the signs on the horizon and the signs within yourself. And the signs on the horizons is the one that's concerning me at the moment. The signs on the horizon suggest that we should attend to the physical and the social world, the world of things that are going on in our society that constitute a set of signs. So, according to the Quran, to ignore the world as we see it is to ignore a set of signs that are vital in discerning the divine. And of course, the very important dimensions of the self, so that one's being, one's inner life, one's feelings and one's experiences, one's spiritual unfolding, one's inner vigilance, also constitute a strata of signs. And perhaps people treading a tariqah tend to focus on this inner life, sometimes not always attending to the signs on the horizon as much. So the notion that these three realities, the Quran, the human being, and the outer world, are intimately tied, the inner and the outer, the manifest and the hidden, the social and the individual, each in relationship with the other, constituting an interconnected set of signs that provide humanity with guidance. And that our relationship to al-haq is through engaging these three sets of signs. And I'm concerned with the set of signs that are on the horizon and how we forge a path of devotion and living the truth and living in light of the realities that we encounter today. The title that Shaikh Fadlala gave to me originally was, "What would Ibn Arabi say today?" And I've been asking very deeply, with a deep struggle, what Ibn Arabi would say today. And I've spent time in deep inner turmoil at the condition of things in our country. And Janie reminded me this morning that in fact I'm following a sunnah, that the Prophet ﷺ sat struggling deeply with the distress and the conditions of his society. And for those of you that are foreign, we are going through, and who don't know our local scenario, we're going through an excruciating time of violence in this country, particularly violence against women. Within the last 2 months, there have been a number of horrific incidents. We've had a 17-year-old girl, Anine Boyson, who was gang raped by a group of young men. At least one of those young men was whom she grew up with and knew closely as a friend. And not only was she gang raped, she was killed, and her body was cut up and horrifically mutilated. And this happened in an area of the Western Cape racked by poverty, unemployment, and alcohol abuse. And in the event that we attempted to think this only happens as a result of poverty and socio-economic and structural problems, close on the heel of this event was the ghastly event and the much publicized event of the murder of Riva Steenkamp by her Paralympian lover, Oscar Pistorius. And then it was followed by 2 incidents where policemen raped once a woman who went into the police station to report domestic violence. She then got taken into a cell and raped. Another policeman raped a woman who was asked him for a ride. We also have violence against men. We have a Mozambican man who was dragged by a policeman like a dog, not even like the way you would treat a dog, dragged at the back of his van and killed that way. Last year we had a spate of corrective rapes of lesbian women in different parts of South Africa, because the norms of masculinity and male sexuality in our society were so threatened by the presence of lesbian women. And no, this violence is not simply a South African crisis, as the violent gang rape of Jyoti Singh in broad daylight on a bus in Delhi and her subsequent death, or the rape of a 5-year-old, the rape and the murder of a 5-year-old child by her father. And I'm not simply giving you this list of incidents for their shock value, but rather I want us to recognize the level of deep psychological and spiritual assault we are facing as South Africans and as human beings in the world. And yes, somebody may say, well, in fact, this kind of horror has been going on from time immemorial, and perhaps we're only getting more media reports. Even in that case, the fact that it's brought to us in this state at the moment is reflective of something very deeply problematic. And what would Ibn Arabi say to us in this context? And for those of you who don't know or care about Ibn Arabi, God forbid, what would one's inner guidance say? Now, for some, the answer to the reality of suffering and pain in the world, some wise people actually, have provided the answer that the world is exactly as it should be. And that our lenses are only limited by the fact that we see the zahir, and that we don't see this other level of reality. And that might be an answer. In fact, when I lived in Philadelphia and was amongst a group of some of the most wise souls I have encountered, used to call me the little firebrand. I used to bring all of my questions of social justice with great passion to the table. And I was told a number of times, I was told this elaborate story, and then, this extremely intense story, which always inevitably ended with the awareness that the world is an illusion. And I would be asked to wake up, echoing the hadith that when we're in this world we are asleep and when we die we wake up. And no doubt, I'm not denying the possibility of this explanation. In fact, there's probably a profound level of truth. Yet, there are other dimensions of our lives and our reality for which that perspective at this point is extremely dangerous to hold by itself. When people of the spirit become quietist and accept the injustices of the world as part of the delusionary aspects and do nothing to change it, then we, in my view, are abdicating an important religious responsibility. And here the prophetic tradition, where our master, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has told believers that if we witness injustice, we are to stop it with our hands and our actions. And if we cannot do that, we should speak out against it. And if we cannot do that, we should pray against it and in our hearts resist it. And that the last form is the weakest form of faith. And so I'm saying that what is going on in this world, the seemingly ceaseless physical and sexual assault on women, the violence of men against other men, is something that demands our intervention at all three levels of belief. The world in its messiness and in its beauty, and its beauty may seem less visible to some of us at the moment, is really the workshop of the Spirit. Let me say again that this world with its messiness is the workshop of the Spirit, and it is a set of signs that the Quran calls upon us to engage in our pursuit of the One. And in these times of turmoil, abdication is simply not an option. And here I found some very helpful reflections from Ibn Arabi's book of advice. 3 aphorisms that I've been reflecting on. In fact, I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine saying, I'm in this state of perplexity and I'm not quite sure. And of course, I have a great love for Ibn Arabi. Those of you who attended, the conference last year, one of the things that I love doing is thinking about all these exquisite visions of beauty that Ibn Arabi presents, and I'm just incapable of doing that right now. So I turned back to our Shaikh al-Akbar, and I said, well, what do you have to say to me, Shaikh? And he said a couple of really interesting things. The first of the aphorisms that I'm going to look at is the state of sabr, and I like how James Morris has translated sabr, actually. He's translated as perseverance in the face of affliction. And Ibn Arabi says, the state of sabr in which you don't complain to God cannot be relied on. So when Shaykh Lala said this morning, the moment somebody complains, he runs away. Shaykh Lala, I hope he hasn't run away. Okay, because now we tell us very clearly, when you don't complain to God, that can't be relied on. In fact, somewhere in our complaints, at the current state of things, I suppose, is a deep pain within us as human beings, at the possibilities that human beings can behave as barbarously as they're behaving. And the second aphorism, the state of sabr, in which you don't hear God's complaining through His servants to Himself about what they are suffering, cannot be relied on. So our sabr, our perseverance in the face of affliction, is not one of passive acceptance. Our sabr demands that we hear the suffering of fellow human beings, and that we do not allow ourselves to be close to the plight of others, that we don't simply block out the turmoil and pain of others as a psychological shield of protection that we often need in South Africa, since it's so hard sometimes to live in the context of such enormous socio-economic disparities and inequalities. When we encounter people suffering every day, part of us has to shut down. If we were to engage with complete open-heartedness, we would not survive. But it demands that we see and that we hear suffering, and that we open our hearts to the signs on the horizon and let it enter into our being and compel us to engage it as something that we are doing in pursuit of al-haq, the truth. And the third aphorism, absolute contentment with everything that God has decreed cannot be relied on. Most of us, at least most of all, we cannot be content with the state of the world as it stands. Even if we debate what it is that God decreed and what is it that human beings create, we cannot be content with the violent dehumanization of the world as it stands. Shaykh Fadlullah pointed us to a Quranic verse this morning that I really liked. What has touched you of goodness in this Quranic verse that he cited, what has touched you of goodness is from Allah, and what has afflicted you is from yourself. So the violence in this world is the product of the society we have created, and we cannot be content with that. And even if we do feel immobilized, as we all sometimes do, by the enormity of injustice and violence, perhaps, and our feelings that perhaps we're too small to change things in the big scheme. We cannot be content with that. In fact, one of the things that I loved about Jamie's talk this morning was the fact that she, sometimes you feel all this craziness, that she took it upon herself to respond in a particular way to the crisis that she experienced in her country, in her context. And she began studying the Quran, and she began to engage her students, her teenage students. And those 12 students, even if she just did it with 12 students once, go out into the world, and their entire perception of an other changes. Their entire perception of an other becomes a perception of a fellow human being with something that is shared of their humanity. So we actually are able, in the smallest ways, and each of us have those options in our lives, to do something. And I think her experience illustrated for us that in each of our lives, the openings to bring goodness and dignity to the lives of those around us are always available. We need to dwell in those openings and activate our Khalifa in response to the challenge of violent abuse. And now I want to add another point. We cannot think of the problem as a problem out there. We cannot separate from the people and the things that are taking place in our societies. The dehumanization of people around us is the dehumanizations of our own being. Our being, each of our being is intimately connected with each life around us in ways that are both subtle and evident. And while it might be easy and even maybe psychologically gratifying to label men who rape and murder and mutilate women and mutilate and murder other men as monsters and evil people who are different from us, this is not always helpful in the big scheme. Human beings who can perpetrate such acts of violence are not odd, crazy people who have grown up in isolation. They are human beings who have been formed within families and communities. And here, our communities and our society has failed them and has failed us. We did not provide a sufficient protection against these men turning into rapists and murderers. Our family structures and our communities have not provided models of masculinity that have worked. And we are being called to bear witness to the failure of our own models or the inability of us to create effective alternative models. We are not separate from these men. They are not monsters. They are a product of our society and our world, and we all, at least partially, are implicated in their descent to what the Quran calls the lowest of the low. This is not, of course, my attempt to discount individual responsibility from those men for their choices, because they chose to descend to the lowest of the low. We as human beings are each finely balanced between the determining structures of our society and a set of choices we as free human beings make. And we as human beings within the communities need to open up ways to contribute to a society that nourishes human beings, where each human being can see the other as the carrier of a sacred presence. And so our tragedy is twofold. We are in mourning and lamentation. We are in lamentation for the women who have been killed, and we are in lamentation and mourning for the men who have lost touch with their own sacred center. And here, there's another vital point that I want to make. This issue of treating women with dignity and respect, it's not a woman's issue. Our humanity as men and women are equally at stake in treating women justly and fairly. And I'm not simply talking about resisting violence. Violence is the end of the spectrum of injustice. It's the final manifestation of a social structure that creates men and women in fundamentally different ways and in ways that disrespect women. I'm speaking about the full range of individual behaviors and communal norms. We need to create those that facilitate the well-being and the health of men and women alike. And it includes all the less powerful. It's not just about men and women. It's about all the stigmatized peoples in our societies, all the people in marginal presences. The people that the Prophet responded to in his society. He responded to the slaves, to the orphans, to those that resided on the margins whose humanity was never recognized. And we too need to follow that sunnah. So the foreign refugees, the children who don't have power, who are relatively powerless children, foreign refugees, gay and lesbian people, people who occupy the social margins are people we need to attend to how we construct the humanity of people on the margins. The humanity of men and of the powerful in society is conditional on the ways that men treat women and other less powerful segments of the society. This, I think, is a sign on the horizon that demands our response. And it's perhaps for that reason that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said the following. The believer with the most complete faith is the one with the best character and disposition. And the one with the best character is one who treats women with dignity and honor. Thus we need to figure out how our personal, individual and communal lives, how can we promote the refinement of character and the betterment of people in our society. And it requires us to take a fundamental, hard, critical look at the norms of our lives, of each of our lives. We need to ask, how is it that we teach our children to be young men and young women? What are the roles that we prescribe for them? What possibilities do we limit in the roles that we prescribe for them? How are we, both men and women? How do we practice justice in our most intimate relationships with our partners? And how nurturing are we to people outside of our inner group? How do young men speak about sexual conquest as a mark of their masculinity? How do they laugh at sexist stereotypes? How do heterosexual people laugh at jokes around gay and lesbian people? In which ways do we not provide spiritual nurture for those that are not like ourselves? What kinds of things do we overlook? Which things do we dismiss? Which behaviors among powerful men do we avert our gaze from? Which battles do we shy away from and we refuse to wage? Gender violence, both in its structural and physical manifestation, is, in my view, a result of a deficit in our moral capacities to imagine and live with a vision of the human being based on social justice and human dignity. And I ask these questions. As I ask them, I remember that our Prophet, peace be upon him, came both as a warner and as a bringer of good tidings. And maybe I've done too much of the former and too little of the latter, but I think I'm very glad that Shaikh Kabir did a lot of the former. But let me do just a little bit of that as well, because it's not in my nature to end on a note of such intense pain. A time of crisis, actually, and Jamie said something beautiful this morning. She said that the law sat on the heart, and the reason it sat on the heart is when there was a breaking of the heart, the law could be absorbed in the heart, and it's in the moments in moments of brokenness and suffering that something can penetrate into our beings. And so a time of crisis is also a time of opportunity. And yesterday I had a wonderful conversation with a friend that's here, with Shirley. And we were both lamenting the current situation and our own sense of immobility and what we could do. And she gave me some very beautiful insights, actually. And we were speaking about the fact that it's not just this violence against women, it's actually a broader violence. It's about how we are destroying our planet at the most ridiculous rate, blindly destroying our planet and our ecosystems in the pursuit of things, and we're completely unaware of it. Okay, and so there's a particular kind of form of power where there's a lack of attention. It's the same kind of power that creates patriarchies. It's the same kind of power that utilizes the earth for its own benefit and doesn't care about sustenance. Okay, and so the contradictions of this crisis, this ecological crisis that we're facing, and this gender crisis that we're facing, presents us with opportunities. It's a breaking down, it's the cracking of the heart, it's a crisis that demands our responsiveness. And this opportunity will only allow us to be transformed or to live in a transformed world if each of us consciously take it upon ourselves to act with a different kind of awakening. And Shelley had a very interesting reading of the situation as it stands. She says, well, there's a change of consciousness. In some spaces of the world, there's this awareness of what we're doing ecologically. There's an awareness of if you're thinking about a male archetype, how those forms of traditional male archetypes are no longer productive for human life. And so that there's a kind of, some people, I shy away from this language generally in my work, but some people are becoming aware of a more divine feminine. And I do complicate these categories, so we can talk about that later. But the notion of a different form of engaging the world. And that perhaps the craziness that we're seeing now is the last kicks and screams of a patriarchal order whose time has come to go. And that's one way to read the crisis, and I prefer to read it that way. And actually, I think this moment of crisis, and I'm going to draw on something that Jamie said earlier, it hurls us back to that moment, that primordial moment when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us and the angels protested that we would shed blood. And Jamie noted, yes, and God knew we would shed blood, and He chose to create us anyway, because He knew what the angels knew not. And maybe this crisis is hurling us back to that moment where God knew something of our capability and our potential that we have to embody and act. And in embodying and acting that potential, we can descend to the highest of the high. Perhaps what the angels did not know is that we are created to be Kamal. We are created to be complete. We are created to harmonize. We are to harmonize all of the divine attributes. In Ibn Arabi's terms, we are created to be the microcosm of all of the Asma al-Husna. That we are intended to harmonize the attributes of power and those of beauty and majesty, and mercy, the Jamal and the Jalal. So we need to begin to forge models and behaviors, both psychologically, individually, and socially. We need to model all of this on the divine who tells us with no doubt that Allah's mercy precedes and overcomes Allah's majesty. That beauty and mercy are the crucible through which any form of power should emerge. That compassion and mercy are the most primary existential imperatives that will raise us to the highest of our fitrah. And another sign of the precedence of mercy is evident, and I'm quoting a wonderful Sufi thinker, Rabia Terry Harris, who notes to us in an article of hers, that one of the most sublime signs of the precedence of mercy is embodied in the Quran by the fact that out of the 114 verses of the Quran, 113 of these start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the compassionate and the merciful, two completely merciful names. And so she adds, maybe that's the proportion of Jalal to Jamal we should have. 133 of mercy to one of majesty. Maybe the world would look very different if we had that proportion of Jamal and Jalal. So I would argue that we probably don't have that much space for too many Shamsas right now. I must tell you a funny story about that. I went to go and visit Konya for a day, and I went to I went to give my salams and my respect to both Rumi and Shams. And I was actually told to visit specifically Shams by Jamal Noor Khoja, who's the Shaikh of one of the orders there, and she said to me how much she really liked Rumi's tomb, but Shams was her man, that was the tomb where the presence was. And so I went there with a lot of expectation that Shams was, and I think of myself as, got a fair amount of Jalal, so I thought, I would maybe resonate with that. And I went into Rumi's tomb area, and I just felt like I was bathed in blessing and awash in mercy. And it was sublime. It was just the most sublime reception. And I went to Shams. Shamsu's tomb, and I did my 2 rakats, and I said Assalamu alaikum, and I got up and I walked right out. And just spiritually, that was a beautiful, respected presence, but it was just not really what my nature was responsive to at that point. So what I'm maybe saying is that we need a lot more Jalal in the world right now. There's too much unrefined Jalal, and the kind of Jalal we need is something that needs to be refined and refined and refined. So let's abide by a reading of the Quran as it describes itself, Al-Quran al-Kareem, the generous reading. I love that, Al-Quran al-Kareem, a reading of generosity. Generosity is central to how we should read the human condition. Let us model our behavior on the Prophet Muhammad, who the Quran describes as Rahmat al-Alameen, mercy to the worlds. And let us reflect, and I want to conclude with this Quranic verse, which calls on the believing men and the believing women who are enjoined as protecting friends, as awliya of one another. And I like the fact, actually, that in this Quranic verse, the Quran has all these beautiful ways in how it puts together virtue. But this one really stuck out for me. Maybe it's just where I'm at the moment. The notion of protection, protecting friends of one another. And before we do any of our own ibadat, they enjoin what is just and forbid the evil. And so the priority of that imperative in the world seems to be beckoning very strongly right now. And then, of course, we observe the regular prayers. And at this point, I also want to say we should never underestimate the role of prayer. So when I say we need to read the horizon, the signs on the horizon, I'm in no way marginalizing the fact that every day one should be on your prayer mat beseeching the merciful to help us in this process of transforming our world into a place where compassion and humanity and the highest of our possibilities can manifest. And so all of the virtue that I think this Quranic verse outlines, all of the reward for acting virtuously. But the greatest bliss is the good pleasure of God, for that is the supreme felicity. And may we all, inshallah, enter into the presence of the good pleasure of our Creator. Ameen.